I am not a man who believes in the supernatural. My days are a procession of the mundane, a steady rhythm of routine. From 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, I sit in my office on the 30th floor, surrounded by the cold, unfeeling fortress of steel and glass. The hum of human ingenuity comforts me. The carpet beneath my feet feels solid, real. I manage the wealth of those more fortunate than myself, an anonymous figure lost in the machine of commerce. When the dying light of the setting sun begins to seep through the blinds, I descend in the sealed elevator to the sterile parking garage. The ritual is always the same. I climb into my Honda Civic, its familiar weight beneath me, and drive the long, unremarkable miles to my suburban home. For 30 years, my life has moved in predictable, dull steps. The rare, unsettling dreams that plague my sleep fade with the morning, slipping away like whispers in the dark. Everyone has nightmares, right? It was supposed to be Elizabeth, my wife, taking Jenny to summer camp, but something came up at work. So there I was, driving northwest on I-89, a Sunday afternoon, the sun glaring high overhead. The road was nearly empty, yet the trees lining the highway cast deep, impenetrable shadows. The sunlight barely broke through the dense branches, creating a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Jenny, my stepdaughter, was buried in her book as usual, silent and distant. I tried to make conversation, but her brief, dismissive answers left me retreating into my own thoughts. The monotonous chorus of cicadas filled the car, droning endlessly. I hadn't been this far north in years. Not since I was a child, when my parents rented a small house deep in the Vermont woods. I hadn't thought about it in decades. It wasn't avoidance, just a middle-aged man leaving the past behind, forgetting the eerie stillness of those summers. But as the car rumbled along, something gnawed at the edges of my mind. When I saw the familiar dirt road snaking into the woods, my hands moved on their own, slowing the car, pulling it off to a rest stop that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Jenny glanced up from her book, her expression uneasy. I forced a smile. "It's fine," I told her, my voice hollow. "We have time. I want to show you the place where I spent my summers, where I used to live." My mother had called it our kingdom back then, our private realm hidden in the forest. The nearest town was a half-hour away, but to a young boy, it might as well have been another world. The house itself was unremarkable, but the land was something else. Thick pines crowded the landscape, their branches twisted and heavy, blocking the sun. The air always seemed too still, too quiet. The ground, covered in a carpet of pine needles, felt as if it absorbed all sound. At night, they fell like whispers, and in the morning, everything was dusted in a layer of dry husks. The days stretched on in a strange, dreamlike haze, where nothing felt entirely real. It was as if the trees, the rocks, and the streams wore masks, hiding something deeper, something ancient and hungry beneath their surfaces. I had known it even then, without anyone telling me. The land wasn't ours. We were intruders, tolerated guests in a kingdom that belonged to something else. My mother had spoken of fairies, but not the harmless winged creatures of children's stories. No, these were creatures of the wild, beings woven into the land itself. They revealed themselves in the shimmering webs of dew, in the shifting patterns of fallen pine needles. They were always watching, waiting. And now, as I stood on the edge of the road, staring into the dark maw of the forest, I felt their eyes on me again. I often swam in the small, pristine lake near our house. Its waters were normally warm, welcoming, but on the days when it turned suddenly cold, I knew exactly who was responsible. The fairies. They were fickle creatures, their emotions shifting like the wind, bound only to the will of their ancient and fearsome king. I remember it all so clearly now, the same eerie wonder and cold dread that gripped me as a child tightens around my heart once more. The Fairy King. He was powerful, older than the forest itself, and his throne was deep within the woods, in a hidden palace no human could truly claim to see. It wasn't made of stone or gold, but of nature itself. A small, almost imperceptible clearing encircled by towering birch, dogwood, and pine trees. In the center of this place, a vernal pool gleamed, its surface smothered in green algae and strange, shifting vegetation. This was the heart of his kingdom, and he demanded tribute. Without it, we'd risk his wrath. When I say we, I mean Jack and me. There were other children whose families also summered in the kingdom, but Jack was my closest friend, my only real companion in those forgotten woods. He was a few years older, sturdy, with sunburnt cheeks and wild hair, his eyes as blue and sharp as a midsummer sky. People always said we were opposites. Jack, the loud, boisterous one, full of energy, while I was quiet, withdrawn, more at home in the pages of a book or lost in daydreams. But in the kingdom, we were inseparable. We ran through the trees, capturing frogs, chasing dragonflies, paying our respects to the fairies who allowed us to wander their land without consequence. It was Jack who showed me how to weave the wreaths we left as offerings. Small, fragile things made of twigs, grass, and fragrant herbs. And it was I who told him the secret of the dragonflies, how some of them were not insects at all, but fairies in disguise, their size and color reflecting their hidden power. We had learned to respect their presence, to watch them closely as they hovered and darted above the pool, always knowing they were watching us in return. That last summer in the kingdom was different. I was 8 years old. My mother, preoccupied with my newborn brother, paid me little attention, and my father was off on one of his endless business trips. The woods had become my refuge, my sanctuary from schoolyard bullies and family indifference. I could shed my skin, my burdens, and run free with Jack at my side, at least. Jack and his family arrived a day after us. I remember I was climbing a pine tree when I spotted their old station wagon rumbling up the dirt road. I scrambled down, my hands and knees scraped raw by the bark, and raced to their house, expecting the usual greeting. But what I saw instead chilled me to my core. Jack's parents were unloading the car, their voices sharp with irritation as they yelled at a tall, sullen figure standing off to the side. I couldn't see his face at first, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. Jack wasn't helping them. He just stood there, motionless, and when his mother snapped at him to at least grab his suitcase, the figure snarled in reply. The voice was familiar, but twisted, cold. I froze. That couldn't be Jack. When I finally saw his face, my heart sank. He had changed. He was taller, thinner, but it wasn't his body that alarmed me. It was his expression. His once kind face had hardened, his mouth curled in disdain, his eyes dull, empty, and cruel. This wasn't the Jack I knew. "Hey, kiddo." Jack's father called to me, trying to break the tension. But Jack didn't look at me. He didn't even acknowledge me. Instead, his icy gaze slid over me like I wasn't there. "Yeah, well, I didn't want to come," Jack spat, turning back to his father. "I'd rather be rafting with Travis and Mike." His father sighed, tired of the same argument. "It's only 4 weeks. You'll manage." Jack's eyes flicked to me then, cold and unfeeling. "Guess I'm stuck with him, huh?" He sneered. His father shot him a look of disgust, then turned back to the suitcases. Jack's mother gave me a brief, tight smile, as if she pitied me. But I couldn't smile back. I couldn't even move. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, praying that if I looked away and back again, the real Jack would be standing there, laughing, grinning like he always did. But no. Jack turned away without a word and disappeared into the woods, pushing roughly through the branches like they were nothing. I followed Jack numbly through the woods, my legs moving on their own. Where else could I go? He was heading straight for the palace, the heart of the fairy kingdom, and Kochu. I realized with a sinking dread that he either didn't know or didn't care. I had to run just to keep up, my feet catching on roots and the pine needles scratching at my ankles like tiny claws. I almost lost him several times, but I knew deep down that he wouldn't answer if I called out to him. By the time we reached the clearing, the palace proper Jack abruptly stopped and turned to face me. His expression was calculated, a mask barely holding together. "Listen," he said, the smile on his face not quite reaching his cold, empty eyes. His arms were outstretched, palms up, as if in surrender. It reminded me of my father, how he used to stand half apologetic, as he explained that he'd be missing my birthday for the 3rd year in a row. A sudden wave of hatred surged through me, sharp and bitter. "Listen," Jack repeated, his voice too casual, too forced. "It's not that you. I mean, you're okay and all, but all that fairy king stuff, the spells and magic or whatever, you don't still believe in that, right?" He paused, the sneer twisting his mouth. "I mean, it's pretty dumb, right?" I think, up until that moment, I had clung to some desperate hope that things could still be fixed. That maybe, just maybe, we could forget this awful day, start over, with the Fairy King as our silent witness. But at Jack's final humiliation, something dark and vicious stirred inside me. I wanted to hurt him. "I don't know," I said, forcing the words out slowly, savoring them. "You must be pretty dumb if Travis and Mike didn't want to hang out with you." Something snapped in Jack's face. His eyes, once cold, flared with rage. Before I could react, he lunged at me, shoving me hard. I stumbled backward, tripping over a gnarled root and landing flat on my back. And then he was on top of me, his face twisted into a mask of fury, his breath hot and rapid. His hands closed around my throat, squeezing. His other fist drew back, ready to strike. "You little," he hissed, the words spilling out in jagged breaths. "Now you like the fairies because you are one, you." I didn't even know what the last word meant, but from the venom in his voice, I could tell it was something vile, something meant to hurt. Suddenly, the crushing weight lifted and I gasped for air. But I had no time to recover before Jack yanked me to my feet, dragging me forward. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a chaotic mess, but the realization hit me like a cold wave. We were heading for the vernal pool. Panic set in. I twisted in his grasp, apologizing, babbling, but Jack didn't care. His grip tightened, and I could feel the wet, rotting smell of the pool creeping up on us. The scent of fresh grass and sap mingling with the unmistakable stench of decay. Jack finally let go when I was just inches from the water's edge. I wavered, not daring to look behind me, the scummy surface of the pool threatening to swallow me whole. Jack stood a few feet away, his face lit up with a twisted, genuine smile. He was enjoying this. "Go for a swim," he called, his voice bright and mocking. I turned to run, but Jack was quicker. He shoved me hard, and my feet slipped, the water rising over my sneakers, hot, thick, and teeming with unseen, writhing life. My heart raced, my mind screaming, but all I could do was cry, sobbing helplessly. My tears seemed to anger him further. Jack began pacing, shouting at me like a rabid dog, his voice sharp and wild. In my panic, I turned, only to feel a sharp pain slice through my ear as a stone grazed it. I fell to my knees, the murky water splashing into my mouth, filling my nose with the foul taste of rot. It wasn't just water, it was alive, crawling and pulling at me, dragging me down into its depths. A black terror took hold, suffocating me. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't fight. All I could do was sink. The stench of the pool invaded my senses, thickening the air and filling my mind with a heavy, suffocating sludge. I felt as if my very blood had turned to muck, my lungs struggling against an invisible current. Just as the darkness began to swallow me whole, I was lifted into enormous arms, gazing up into the face of something profound, both ancient and newborn, a being that had lived countless lives, for whom death was merely a fleeting pause before the next breath of life. The inside of my eyelids glowed a soothing green, and in my drowsiness, I thought how comforting it would be to drift forever in this timeless abyss. When I opened my eyes again, the world was harsh and real. I lay on the ground, the sharp bite of twigs and roots digging into my back. Nearby, someone was whimpering, their cries echoing through the stillness. As my vision cleared, I saw Jack a short distance away, trembling and groveling before a presence I could not see. His face was pale, his eyes wide and blue, shining with a terror that sent chills down my spine. "Please, please," he whined, desperation dripping from his voice. "I'm sorry. I'll be good, I promise." His tone was strange, almost sing-song, a twisted parody against the wild panic etched on his features. I felt it before I heard it, a low, ominous thrumming, reverberating through the air around us, growing louder and more intense. Jack's pleas morphed into a frantic, high-pitched wail, his mouth stretching into a grotesque grin, yet his eyes darted around, searching for escape. And then I saw them, flies. They covered every inch of his body, a writhing mass of darkness, leaving only his wild, frantic eyes free from their swarm. Jack began to dance, limbs flailing in a manic jig, his movements punctuated by short screams and squeals. With each leap, the buzzing around him multiplied, the flies swirling and thickening, feeding on his fear. I threw my arms over my head, burying my face in the fragrant pine needles, desperate to block out the sound, the agonized screams mingling with the furious buzzing. Then, as if a spell had been cast, silence enveloped me. I dared to lift my head, and dread washed over me. I was alone in the palace. The vernal pool lay before me, its surface smooth and still. The only evidence of Jack's frenzied dance, a series of slow ripples spreading from the center. It appeared smaller and shallower than I remembered, more a deep puddle than a magical pool. Yet the lush, vibrant green remained, and I knew that the water was unnaturally warm. Winded from my struggle through roots and overgrown branches, I leaned against the nearest tree to catch my breath. Jenny stood a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the pool, curiosity lighting her eyes as she traced her fingers over the papery bark of a dogwood tree. "Dad, why is the water so green?" she asked, her voice innocent, yet carrying an edge of something darker. I noted the initial stumble in her speech. She had been shaken by the loss of her mother's husband the previous year. My wife had assured me that her daughter harbored no ill will towards me, yet Jenny remained guarded, her emotions tightly closed off. Memories of that day returned in spasms, fragmented flashes of stumbling backward through the woods toward home, stopping at one point to empty my stomach. My mother filled in the gaps during our later conversations. I was crying, raving, and Jack's name spilled from my lips enough times to raise alarms. Jack's body was found shortly thereafter, floating face down in the vernal pool. The police hesitated to declare drowning as the cause of death. Both of his eyes had been plucked clean from their sockets. My mother told me Jack's father took his own life months later, a casualty of the darkness that had descended upon us. "That's why the water is so green," I replied, forced into the present moment. "A lot of different creatures live in bodies of water like this one." Jenny nodded slowly, wrinkling her nose. "It's kind of stinky." "This is where the Fairy King lives," I heard myself say, the words spilling from my mouth before I could think. I hadn't uttered that name in over 30 years. "He mostly stays hidden away, but he loves gifts. Let me show you." Jenny watched intently as I selected a springy twig, bending it into a tight circle, tying it closed with a slender blade of grass. Her focus was unwavering as she meticulously crafted her own wreath, adding a small white wildflower that brought an unsettling beauty to the creation. I observed her busy hands, her brow furrowed in concentration, and I recognized the lonely boy I once was in the quiet intensity of her movements. "Ready?" I asked, and Jenny nodded, her eyes wide with anticipation. Together, we stepped forward, gently tossing our offerings into the center of the pool. The circlets floated for a heartbeat before they sank swiftly beneath the surface, swallowed by the dark water. "He took them home," Jenny said, her gaze fixed on the spot where the wreaths had vanished. A slight movement stirred in the air, as though something unseen inhaled deeply, and the edge of the water retreated slightly. Then, bubbles formed in a great surge, breaking the surface like a heartbeat, drawing back as if something waited in the depths. Before I could call her back, Jenny darted forward, crouching at the bank of the pool. "Look," she exclaimed, excitement tinged with something darker. "He gave us something back. Something to thank us." I hurried over, the mud sucking at my shoes, and peered down into the water where she knelt. Two small, perfectly round stones lay nestled in the muck, glistening with an otherworldly blue, reminiscent of the summer sky. "They're so pretty," Jenny murmured, handing me one. I held it in my palm, feeling its warmth and a slick, almost viscous texture. It throbbed in my hand, a steady pulse that made me wonder if the rhythm came from my own fingers or the stone itself. Jenny raised the stone to slip it into her pocket, but I stopped her. "This is a gift from someone very powerful," I warned, my voice low. "You need to remember that." She looked at me solemnly and nodded, and as she did, I felt rather than heard a lazy thrumming in the air, a dark energy stirring from slumber. The atmosphere around us grew unbearably still, wrapping us in an oppressive silence, a reminder of the eternal cycle of life and the things that rotted in the dark.